Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I don't make these videos as often as I would like, but here I am again with another time lapse. And this time, taking advantage of the movie's 35th anniversary, I wanted to pay tribute to one of my favorite films of all time. One of those movies I can watch over and over again and that somehow still manage to impress me every single time. Terminator 2, Judgment Day. This time-lapse video have become a kind of nostalgia therapy for me. While I paint, I like to look back at what these movies mean to me and why decades later they still hold such an important place in my memory. What can possibly be said about Terminator 2 that hasn't already been said? Today, it's considered an absolute classic of action cinema and groundbreaking film in the history of visual effects. And what's remarkable is that watching it again 35 years later, so many of those effects still look incredible. Some sequences could even put modern CGI heavy production to shame. But for those of us who actually lived through that era, the impact was different. 5 years earlier, in 1986, James Cameron had released Aliens, which for me, at the time, represented pretty much the highest quality level of action and science fiction movie could possibly reach. And then Terminator 2 came along and took the crown. But my obsession with Terminator had started much earlier with the original 1984 film. The first time I saw it was, to make things even worse, on Betamax. A pirated copy rented from a little neighborhood video store. Probably a copy of a copy of a copy with absolutely terrible image quality, but it didn't matter. The idea of a robot disguised as a human being moving forward with brute force, taking bullets, and destroying everything in its path fascinated me immediately. I also remember that iconic representation of the Terminator's internal vision, the red scanner filled with numbers and data that allowed us for a few seconds to see the world through the eyes of a machine. Today, I found that representation particularly interesting. Not because an artificial intelligence could receive visual information through the cameras, but because that was our 1980s way of imagination how a computer might think. You had to show numbers, letters, cursors, and calculations on a screen so the audience understood that the machine was processing information. That was our visual language for artificial intelligence. And of course, there were the scenes. The pistol with a laser sight, the wounds revealing the machine underneath the skin, the Terminator repairing itself in front of a mirror, and above all, the massacre at the police station. For me, that was a shock. James Cameron had managed to create all this in a relatively small budget using miniatures, makeup, animatronics, stop motion, optical effects, and pretty much every film-making trick available at the time. But when Terminator 2 arrived, everything jumped several levels. The T-1000 walking through the prison's bars, its arm transformations transforming into stabbing weapons, blending into the floor, the chase through the Los Angeles Flood Control Channel, the T-1000 being frozen by a liquid nitrogen, shattering into pieces and then slowly putting itself back together. It all seemed impossible. And here is something that sounds almost unbelievable today. All of the T-1000 and CG ads up to only about 4 or 5 minutes of the entire movie, spread across just over 40 shots. That's it. But those few minutes require a team of around 35 people, add industrial light and magic. In some cases, rendering just 15 seconds could take as long as 10 days. And more importantly, the T1000 was never just CGI. Cameron combined ILM's digital effects with prosthetics, animatronics, stunts doubles, optical effects, and practical techniques from teams such as Stan Winston's. Maybe that's one of the reasons the movie had aged so well. The digital effects appear only when they are actually needed. Cameron had already used the Avis in 1989 as something of a testing ground for this technology with the famous computer-generated water creature. 2 years later, he pushed that idea much further and turned the effect itself into a character, the T1000. But there's another great details about the character that can easily go unnoticed. Robert Patrick trained specifically to make the T1000 look unhuman while running. He practiced running at high speed while breathing through his nose so the character would appear exhausted. The idea was simple. A machine doesn't need to gasp for air. He trained so intensely that during the chase with John Connor, he could reportedly catch up with Edward Furlong while he was riding the motorcycle. Curiously enough, I don't remember exactly when I first saw Terminator 2. I'm not even completely sure whether my first viewing was in a movie or a theater or a video. I was a teenager at the time, and much of our access to movies came through VHS and Betamax. But I do have several very specific memories connected to the film. One of them is the music. I was just beginning to get seriously into rock music, and I remember buying Use Your Illusion on a cassette. Back then, you mostly had access to the big mainstream band. Metallica and Guns N' Roses were basically must-haves. And then there was You Could Be Mine. And there is another interesting story behind that. The song wasn't originally written for Terminator 2. Guns N' Roses had been developing it since the Appetite of Destruction era. But T2 needed a huge band to accompany a huge movie, and Schwarzenegger personally helped bring Guns N' Roses into the project. He even arranged a meeting with the band at his home. The result was one of those perfect combination of music and cinema that could only have happened in the early 90s. And the music video pushed the crossover even further. Arnold appears once again as the T-800, this time assigned to locate Guns N' Roses. After analyzing the members of the band, he targets Axl Rose and ultimately decides not to eliminate him because it will basically be a waste of ammunition. It was movie promotion, music video, and a tiny piece of the Terminator universe all at once. Another memory I strongly associate with that period is arcades. Those places that in Colombia in the time were sometimes seen as slightly shabby, but where I spent countless hours of my teenage life. And naturally, there were Terminator 2 arcade games as well. So ironically, Terminator 2 eventually became another kind of time machine for me. One with a one-way ticket straight back to the early 1990s. And that's one of the reasons I choose this particular scene to paint. Is the introduction of Arnold Schwarzenegger to T-800 when he walks into a biker bar looking for clothes, boots, and of course, motorcycle. Visually, I always loved this sequence. The gloomy atmosphere, the leather textures, the neon lights, the color hitting the skin, and Arnold's monumental physique create an atmosphere that immediately feels like Terminator 2. And the scene does something else that is very clever from a storytelling perspective. You had seen the first movie, Arnold was the monster. At the beginning of the T2, the audience still didn't know exactly what his role was going to be this time. The movie deliberately plays with that expectation. During those opening scenes, both Arnold and Robert Patrick are presented as potential dangerous characters. Then comes the confrontation at the shopping mall. Arnold looks at John Connor and says, "Get down," and fires at the T-1000. The monster from the first movie had become the protector. When I started thinking about which scene I wanted to paint, this introduction to the character felt perfect. But there is another reason Terminator 2 is even more interesting to me today than it was when I was a teenager. For people of my generation, the movie was accidentally become a kind of document of just how quickly technology can change. Within the same movie, we see completely different technological eras living side by side. The Terminator uses payphone to call landlines because that was exactly what existed in 1999. John Connor uses a tiny Atari portfolio computer to hack an ATM. We see CRT televisions, cassette tapes, an overwhelmingly analog world. And yet, at the same time, the story is talking about neural networks, learning machines, automated military systems, and an artificial intelligence called Skynet. I personally had to live through and adapt to much at that transformation. The landline, the cassette, the CD, the floppy disk, the internet, the cell phone, the smartphone, and now artificial intelligence. In fact, while making this video, I'm using artificial intelligence tools myself. Even this very script is being corrected and discussed with me by an LLM. And this is where Terminator start becoming really interesting again. Because I've asked this model many times, how far are we really from Skynet? The answer is usually reassuring, very far. Current AI systems are not Skynet. They don't independently possess that combination of autonomy, military control, physical infrastructure, strategic capability, and access to weapons that we see in the movies. But at the same time, we are beginning to talk about AI agents capable of carrying out increasingly complex tasks with less human intervention, multimodal systems that can see and hear humanoid robots, autonomous vehicles, and weapons, incorporating increasing degrees of automation. So another question inevitably appears: how far are we from the T-800? Here, the differences are still enormous. Cameron's T-800 is basically an anthropomorphic tank. It can run, fight, drive vehicles, use tools, understand language, and provide strategies, and continue functioning after taking ridiculous amounts of damage. Today's humanoid robots are much more fragile, their energy autonomy is limited, and we are still far from combining all of those capabilities into a completely autonomous machine. But there is something fascinating about all of this. When James Cameron made Terminator in 1984, he placed the future war against the machines in the year 2029. 45 years into the future. It sounded impossible far away. When he made Terminator 2, that future was still 38 years away. And today, as I make this painting in 2026, we are only 3 years away. We probably won't have T-800s walking through the nuclear rings looking for John Connors in 2029, and sincerely, Hope we won't have Skynet either. But perhaps Cameron got something much more interesting right. Not exactly what the machines of the future will look like, but that our relationship with them will become one of the defining questions of our time. And maybe that's why Terminator 2 still works so well 35 years later. Because when I was a teenager, I watched it while imagining a distant future. Today, I watch it and realize that, in a strong way, we have already arrived there. And maybe that's why I keep coming back to these movies and paintings, these scenes so many years later. Not only because they remind me who I was, but because they also allow me to measure just how much the world has changed since then. See you on the next trip into the past. And since this is Terminator 2, I think there is only one appropriate way to say goodbye. Hasta la vista, baby.